Hi, welcome to lesson 5 from the new syllabus and lesson 3 of the old syllabus of drafting, pleading and appearances. In this lesson, we will be covering the concepts of promissory note, power of attorney, hire purchase deed, family settlement deeds, and I'll also try to give certain drafting tips in as and when these topics are discussed. So there won't be a separate slide on drafting tips, but as and when these topics are discussed, I'll be giving you certain drafting tips for the respective topic. Promissory note. The fundamental question you should always remember, or you should always try to ask yourself is, what is the governing legislature for for any contract which you're entering into? So it may be any instrument, any contract. So what is the fundamental legislature which is governing such contract? It should be your first question in your mind. So the promissory notes are governed by the Negotiable Instruments Act 1881, right? And so this is how the promissory note has been defined under the act. So firstly, it is an instrument. So it shall be in writing, so it shall not be oral. And it is not a banknote or a currency note. Why do they have to specify that it is not a banknote or a currency note? We will come to that a bit later. Now, it should contain an unconditional undertaking, right? Unconditional. There are no subject tos. It is an unconditional undertaking. Undertaking means a promise signed by the maker. So there is a party called maker. Maker is the one who makes a promissory note, who is actually promising, who is taking the undertaking to pay a certain sum of money. So this undertaking is to pay a certain sum of money. And here the word certain means a fixed sum of money only to or to the order of a certain person or to the bearer of the instrument, right? So now let me give you an example. So first, when I said banknote, if you remember the 10 rupee or the 100 rupee note or whatever be the currency note we have in India, at the back there would be a statement here that it is a promissory note, correct? So every currency note is a promissory note, and whosoever bears it, that is whosoever carries it, will be the owner of that note, correct? So that is how the currency notes have been combined. Hence, this promissory note, which is defined under the Negotiable Instrument Act, is not referring to such currency note. Hence, they said not being a banknote or a currency note. Second, next condition, which contains an unconditional undertaking. So, in a promissory note, imagine two parties, party A, party B. Party A is making a promise to B that, give me 1,000 rupees, I will pay you back in 15 days, right? So the amount involved is very less. I just, for the sake of example, we are taking it 1,000 rupees. Now, for 1,000 rupees, you would not ask for some security, or you might not enter into a loan agreement and all that, because it's a very petty amount. So the best way to do is to take a promissory note. And I'm telling you, this need not necessarily be for 1,000 rupees. Even if it is for hefty amounts like 15 lakhs, 20 lakhs, also there are promissory notes which will be entered into. So now you will enter into a promise note. So in the promise note, what is A saying? A saying that I promise to pay an amount of rupees 1,000. So here the promise to pay is the unconditional undertaking that I'm undertaking to pay a sum of rupees 1,000. So that is nothing but a certain sum of rupees 1,000 to whom? To a certain person, that is B, to B, or to his order. What is meant by to his order? If B orders to give it to C, then I will give it to C. So that is what is the meaning of to the order of, right? Or to the bearer of the instrument. So if it is an instrument, if the instrument is agreed in such a way that whosoever bears it will have the right over it, then it becomes to the bearer of the instrument. So it would be changed accordingly. So I can say I promise to pay an amount of rupees 1,000 to rupees B to B or to his order, or to the bearer of the instrument. So if it is to the bearer of the instrument, I would not mention B or to his order. I would simply say I would promise to pay rupees 1,000 to the bearer of this instrument, and he will give that instrument to B. Correct? So when you're giving the instrument to B, the B is who will be the payee. Right? So here the maker will be the person who made the instrument, that is A. B is the payee. Now, who is the holder of the instrument? So I'm just trying to tell the various parties involved. Holder of the instrument, the one who is holding it, that is the bearer, or the holder. He is the one who will have a right over the instrument. He is what is the holder. In majority of the cases, B himself will be holding, right? So B will be the payee as well as the holder. And next comes the concept of endorser and endorsee. If B endorses it to C, imagine B owes 1,000 rupees to C. So instead of B giving to C, I mean taking from A and giving to C, B thinks, okay, let A give directly to C. So B will endorse his rights of being a receiver to C. So here in case of endorser also, payee will become the endorser. The third party will become the endorse C. So this is essentially the concept of promissory note. So in terms of stamping, it should be noted that the respective state stamp act you have to refer to see if what kind of stamp duty is applicable, right? Um, Next is that it essentially should contain the name of place, number, and a date on which it is made. So it's better because when you're signing it as a maker, the date and the place is something which is always important because it would make sure that it is a valid instrument, right? However, if they are omitted, it doesn't mean it is invalid, right? If at all there is no date on the instrument, it will be deemed that as and when the instrument has been received, that is the date of delivery received by the payee, that would be deemed as a date of the instrument, right? But it is always advisory to have the date because later it becomes difficult to prove the date of the instrument, and it also involves with the Limitation Act and all, and hence it is very important, right? And so before we go further, one principle you should remember in a promissory note is that a mere acknowledgement of debt does not amount to a promissory note. So if in this case A says, I owe an amount of rupees 1,000 to B or to his order, it is not a promissory note because it is not an unconditional undertaking, right? You are not promising, you are not giving any undertaking, you are merely acknowledging a fact. So such mere acknowledgement will not amount to a promissory note. So this is about a promissory note. Power of attorney. So to understand what is a power of attorney, and before I give you the actual essence of it, let us look at the definition of it and also the governing legislature as I pointed out earlier. So the definition has been provided under the Indian Stamp Act 2 subsection 21, wherein it is defined to include any instrument. So first you should remember that it's an instrument empowering a specified person and being empowered to act for and in the name of the person executing it. So there are three things. One, a person who is executing it, executor, correct? And then there is a specified person, correct? And then there is a instrument. So what is this instrument for? Executor is executing this instrument to empower the specified person to act for the executor and in the name of the executor. So this is what is essentially a power of attorney. If you remember this, we have discussed even in lesson number 2, wherein we discussed about deed poll, right? Deed poll is what a power of attorney is. The best example of a deed poll where it is usually in the first person, correct? Right. So now let me give you a simple example to help you understand the concept of power of attorney. Imagine A has a brother B. So A and B are brothers. A stays in USA. Right? Now, A and B have properties, like let us say it's acquired from the father or whatever be the reason, but they have a joint property, which is a land. Now both of them want to sell it away, right? So A came to India. When A and B went and met a buyer, C. So C is ready to buy the property. Now A and B, when A is in India, they have negotiated with C and the prices and all are fixed. Now, so they are supposed to get the registration done, but for some reason C was not able to arrange the money. So C said, I need one more month of a time. But A is supposed to travel back to USA in the next week, which means he would not be available for registration in the next month, which is the requirement of C. So A was okay with it. So now how can A come and sign on the next month? Should he come back to India? Should he book a ticket back to India? That is plain simple, right? It doesn't require a lawyer to advise that. But A should still be in US, but the document should be executed. Is it possible? Can B execute it? Yes, B can execute it, but only for his share. But for the share of A, B, how can B execute it? Or can he execute it? The answer is again yes. But how can he execute it? By way of a power of attorney. So A will be the executor, B will be the specified person. So A will execute a power of attorney, that is the instrument. So instrument is a power of attorney, empowering, that's why the word power, empowering B, who will be the attorney. So empowering B to act for and in the name of A. So this is the meaning of a power of attorney, and hence tomorrow when, I mean the next month when the sale deed is being executed, then B will sign on his behalf and also on the behalf of his brother A and transfer the property to C. So for that to happen, firstly A should execute a power of attorney to B and get it registered, and the same power of attorney will go to the registrar. And why should it be registered? Because I again repeat it, under the Registration Act, any instrument wherein the rights over a property are being hampered, and such instrument shall be registered if the value of the property is more than 100 rupees. So here power of attorney is an instrument which is giving a right to be over property. Hence, it also has to be registered. So A and B will get a power of attorney registered in the registrar office, and the same power of attorney will be used for the purpose of execution of the sale deed in the name of C, and B will be representing it. Right? So this is the concept of a power of attorney. So keep the same example in mind. So now who is the principal in this case? The parties to a power of attorney. Principal is A, the executor, and attorney is B, in whose favor the POA is executed. I hope this is self-explanatory, correct? And it can be executed only in favor of a major. So B has to be a major. And it is usually in the form of deed poll, that is in first person. So usually what is this difference between deed poll and deed poll? Just for the interest of those who wouldn't have completely read, gone through the video. So deed poll is a single, it's made in first person. Deed poll is in third person. That means in deed poll, we would use the words like seller, vendor. We never use the words I, we, he, she. Whereas in deed poll, we would use the words I and we, that is, it is in first person. So how is usually a deed, a power of attorney started? It usually starts with the words, know all men by these presents. So know all men, that means let everyone know that by these presents, that is by the following clauses or the words, that I, Mr. A, son of so and so, hereby appoint Mr. B, son of so and so, to act as my attorney and to do, and in these hereby empowered to do the following acts for, on, and on behalf of A, that is a principal. So that is how a power of attorney is drafted, and all the powers which A wants to delegate to B or which A wants to empower B with shall be clearly laid down in the power of attorney. For example, to execute the sale deed, to collect the money on behalf of A and deposit the same in the account of A. So these are what the specific things you want B to do. So the same things have to come in your attorney. So according to your content, the power of attorney is divided into two. One, a general power of attorney, and two, a special power of attorney. A general power of attorney's purpose is to generally represent the principal and to perform more than one act. So usually where there are multiple things you want to do. For example, A also wants B to go and invest this money somewhere in some equity shares, wherever B deems it fit. So that is a general power of attorney. Whereas A only wants B to execute the sale deed, and the rest deposit of money and all should happen in the electronically in the bank account of A. Only then A would give the right to, only then A would, this power of attorney would be effective. So in that cases, it is called as a special power of attorney, which is executed for the purpose of a specific act. So this differentiation, it is very important for you to know. And next thing you need to remember is the case of Fowler versus Brood, where it is said that in the case of an order for a winding up, in the case of a company where an order for winding up has been given, then all the power of attorneys executed by the directors till that date shall be ceased to a function. Because it makes sense, because the company is winding up, so there is no power which is going to be there anymore in the hands of the directors. They are discharged from their duties. A liquidator will be appointed, and hence all the power of attorneys executed by them will automatically be ceased to be operative. So this is one case you need to remember. Right? And coming to the aspect of revocation of a power of attorney. So usually in a power of attorney, there would also be a clause saying that the attorney, that the principal can at any time at his own discretion, his or her own discretion, revoke the power of attorney. Usually that will be the clause, but however, there are also irrevocable power of attorneys, which we will discuss in the subsequent slide. So revocation means taking back the powers. So power of attorney can also be executed in such a way that the person who is executing it, that is the principal, will have the power to take back the powers given to the attorney. So that is also possible. Now, coming to the aspects of stamp duty and registration. So, in case of a power of attorney, stamp duty would be in respect of the respective states. So, there is no change in that. It's the same. And coming to the registration part, yes, a power of attorney, as I again said in the earlier slide, if it is an instrument dealing with the immovable property and where the value of such immovable property is more than 100 rupees, then yes, that such power of attorney shall be registered as well. Now, let me give another interesting case which I experienced in my experience as company secretary. So there was a case where we had a piece of land, and this land is owned. So this land is actually owned by one of the suppliers of her. Let us say A is the supplier of the company, so he owns this land. He has failed to make payments to the tune of some crores. Like I assume it's around. I mean, if I'm not wrong, it's around some 12 to 15 crore. So now, in return of the consideration, since he's not in a position to repay, we asked him to give us a power of attorney in the name of one of the officers of a company, so that such officer can be executing this land in the name of the company if A fails to make the payment within 30 days. So the fact is A asked for more 30 days to make the repayment, and we said if you fail to make the repayment within 30 days, then our official will execute a power of attorney in the name of the company. He agreed to it. So we waited for 30 days, he failed to make the payment. Then our associate company, imagine B is a person, he is given a board resolution by the company to represent on behalf of the company. So he is representing the company, and A has executed a power of attorney to him, which is POA. So in one single document, that is the sale deed, B is the person who represented A as seller, that is vendor, and who represented B as vendee. So it is a document of it's a sale deed where both the seller and the buyer is the same person, but acting in two different capacities. On behalf of the vendor, he is acting on the capacity of a power of attorney. On behalf of the vendee, that is the purchaser, he is acting on the capacity of a board resolution. Hence, this should establish the concept of a power of attorney and an authorization in your mind. So the moment we authorize someone to do something, he is not doing it in his individual capacity, rather he is doing it on behalf of the other person, and hence these things are completely possible aspects. So the example which I'm giving you is a practical thing which I have witnessed in a case in Indore, in a where we were registering a land property, right? So this is just for the sake of your understanding. Now coming to the concept of irrevocable power of attorney. Usually the agency is coupled with interest. If you remember the last lesson which we discussed on the contract of agency, wherein we said any agency coupled with interest cannot be revoked, correct? So such agencies are usually done through irrevocable power of attorneys. So usually the contract of agencies can be by way of an agreement where it is two parties entering into, it's like an agreement and you do it, or it can be also by way of a power of attorney. Right, because in a power of attorney also the attorney is the relationship between the principal and attorney is as good as a relationship between a principal and an agent only, right? Now another example of irrevocable power of attorney is usually in case of banks, where they give loans. Along with the loans, they will also and take a power of attorney. The reason is, if you fail to create the security interest or charge over the property in my name, then the bank itself should be given the power of attorney, which will be irrevocable. Because if it is a revocable, then he will enjoy the money and he will also not create a security interest in my name. Hence, it will be irrevocable. The bank will be doing all such things if the company is not doing it, right? So that is again, that is one of the examples of an irrevocable power of attorney, where there won't be any chance for the customer, that is the company, to revoke the power of attorney in the favor of financial institution, right? Right. Now, so there is another concept which you need to know, which is letters of authority. So it is not a power of authority. It is, even though it's formal, but it is completely different from the concept of power of attorney. It is not bounded by this Indian Stamp Act or by your other acts. It is a simple letterhead. So it's usually given by the companies on the letterhead in the name of its officers to collect various documents from other officers, or to submit few documents in government offices. We take a letter of authority. So that has nothing to do with the power of attorney, right? So before we conclude this concept, let me just quickly take you through the construction of a power of attorney. That is the rules of construction. That is the interpretation of a power of attorney. So usually in a power of attorney, the entire operative part of the deed, that is the main portion of the deed, is controlled by the recitals. The recital is again a short story. We discussed this in lesson number 2 as to why this power of attorney has been entered into. That plays a very crucial role in a power of attorney, right? And where we give certain authorities a certain particular acts to do, like for example in our earlier example I said A and B own a piece of land, correct? And now they want to execute it to C. So A is going back to USA, he can't be in India, and C has executed a power of attorney in favor of B, and in which he said to do the following acts. Act number 1, to execute the document on behalf of A in his name. Act number 2, to execute any other document to give effect to the sale deed. And act number 3, to do such other acts, deeds or things as may be deemed necessary. The third one is the general word, which is to do such other acts, deeds or things as may be deemed fit and necessary. So this third, the general thing, any other act, deed or thing, you cannot interpret widely. You have to restrict it to what is necessary for the performance of the particular act stated above. So any other act, deed or things necessary would be only in terms of the execution of the sale deed. Just because it's used any other act, deed or thing, it doesn't mean all other properties of A can also be sold away by B. That should not be the interpretation, right? Next, the general words do not confer general powers but are limited to the purpose for which the authority is given, and usually they are construed as enlarging the special powers only when necessary for that purpose. So the main purpose is to execute the sale deed. If it is for that purpose of execution of sale deed, then it will enlarge the special powers given. If not, it will be completely limited to only the purpose of it, right? Now, so yes, and the final one is, again, this is something which I've been keeping on telling from the beginning. It is to include all incidental powers necessary for its effective execution. So all the incidental powers which are deemed, for example, when we say execute it on behalf of A in his name, means it also includes to sign, to initial, everything comes under it. You need not be so specific. All the incidental powers will automatically be included. So this is the discussion on power of attorney. Now, hire purchase deeds. So I hope you people remember the special contracts in the Indian Contract Act 1872, which is the contract of bailment. So what is a contract of bailment? Let us say there are various goods of yours, right? So this is A's goods. Now, A goes to B. So B has a large godown, right? So A wants these goods to be stored in B's godown. So when he stores, he gives certain money. So there is a consideration given for storage, and B also gives a promise to take good care of this products. And this contract is what is bailment. And the bailer and the bailee, A will be the bailer, B will be the bailee. So bailee will take the responsibility to take good care of the products. Correct? So this is a concept of bailment. And if I want to give a much simple example of those who have pets at home, so when you travel, you give the pet to your neighbor to take care of it. So that is also a contract of bailment, wherein the bailee will be, if at all it is charged, yes, it becomes a contract of bailment, where bailee will be taking care of the pet as if it is their own pet. So that is the condition, right? So now in case of a hire purchase deed, what happens? So hire purchase is usually entered into for purchase of expensive products, where a down payment will be made of, let us say, some 20 to 30% down payments will be made, and for the rest, the rest of the payment, that is the balance payment, will be divided into various installments. Installment 1, 2, 3, and so on and so forth. And for each installment, a certain amount would be taken from the purchaser. So here it is not an actual sale per se, for the reason that the title won't get transferred to the purchaser. It is a hire purchase, wherein an option will be given to the purchaser to buy the property. So here we call it the purchaser as hirer. So it's as good as a hiring till the last payment has been made. So the two parties of this contract are owner and hirer. So owner sells a good to hirer through a hire purchase deed, in a hire purchase deed, wherein the hirer will be the one who is taking the good, will get the possession over the good. However, he would still not be the owner, and it is not an hypothecation. If you see, hypothecation hire purchase are also equal till this stage, but in hypothecation it is a pure loan. You repay the loan, you get the property. But here it is not loan. Here there is an option to purchase by the hirer, and it is a contract of hire, that is bailment. So he is taking the property from B, from the owner, and he is maintaining the property as if it is his own, for which there is a payment of certain money being done. And now this money amount which has been paid would be categorized into the concept of, like part payments, and all the payments till the last payment is done, the title won't be transferred. And at any point of time before the last payment is being made, the hirer will have a right to give back the property and stop making further payments, right? So this is what is the concept of a hire purchase deed. So it is a hire purchase, the purchase by way of hiring it. So firstly you hire it, make monthly installments, and these installments will be treated as part of the sale considerations. That is what will be your agreement, and there should be an exclusive clause stating that at any point of time hirer can can give back the property and stop making any further payments. And also hirer will have an option to purchase. There is no compulsion, just that last payment is made, the title need not be transferred. Hirer may still opt not to purchase the property. Correct? So this is what is the concept of a hire purchase deed. So let us quickly go through what are the essential clauses in it. Firstly, the owners agree to let and hirer agrees to hire. Hirer should be given a right to determine the hiring or return the goods. That's what the option. And the right of option of hirer to purchase the goods for a nominal sum at the end of the hearing. And the concept of minimum payment clause. So what is this minimum payment clause? So this is a very important clause in an hire purchase deed, wherein the owner would say, it's not like suppose you take an expensive property and pay for one monthly installment and give it back. That should not be possible. So it says that there should be minimum payment. Apart from the down payment, the rest of your payments together should come to minimum 50% of the total price of the product. So even if you give it back within 2-3 months, you need to make the balance payment which would amount to 50% of the product. So this is called as minimum payment clause. So even though the down payment is hardly 25%, but by way of your other installments, you should reach up to 50% for sure. That is the minimum payment you should make, irrespective of whether you want to buy the property or not. Right? Hope I am able to convey. So this is what the minimum payment clause, and it is very important in a hire purchase deed. Then coming to the concept of stamp duty and registration, again the same thing applies. So stamp duty, as per the Indian Stamp Act, the respective state stamp duties should be looked into, and for registration, if this is dealing or if it is dealing with any immobile property, and yes, registration is also mandatory. And we have to strictly differentiate hire purchase agreement from an agreement of sale, for the simple reason that you should not construe it as an agreement of sale. In an agreement of sale, there is a compulsion to perform the contract, that is to buy the property, whereas in a hire purchase it's not so. It is a mere option, and hence it should be treated as an option only. And then finally, the concept of finally let us look into the types of hire purchase agreement. So the types of hire purchase agreements are two, and it is purely on the basis of finance. Let us say in a case, A is the owner, B is the hirer. A has given the property on hire to B, and now A sells away the property to a financer who will buy the property from A and also take this hire purchase agreement and keep it on its name. And this financer will now be responsible to take the payments from B, and also the rest. Usually, the financer will step into the shoes of A. So this is one type of hire purchase agreement. The second mode is, this is one type that is in between the hire purchase deed. The financer will come and take the property from A. The second mode is when B takes finance from a financer, right? And using this money, B buys the property from A. In the sense that makes the down payment to A and makes monthly payments. So in this case, in return of all these transactions, there would be even a hire purchase agreement made in the favor of F, the financer as well, wherein the financer will be given a right to seize the property if there is a failure of making payment to the financer. So here also what happens is the financer will be taking the burden to make the payment to A in case B fails any installment, in return to which the financier can seize the properties which the B is enjoying. So this is how this is the second type of a hire purchase agreement. But usually these two are in practice, right? So just to mention, there is also this act which is Hire Purchase Act, which was proposed to be enacted. So even the president's assent has been received, but it was completely suspended later. Hence, I don't see any significance of learning it. However, there are various principles which the Hire Purchase Act had established, which still remain the same because it is anyways derived from the Contracts Act itself, and majority of which we have discussed also. But if it's a good read, so you can make a good read of it and try to remember the principles per se. That's all, right? It is available in your material. Now, so coming to the final concept of family settlement deed. So in order to understand a family settlement deed, we should see three cases. One, Kale versus Deputy Director of Consolidation. So this is the first case. This is the case which established completely what is a family settlement deed. Second is the CIT versus R. Ponnamal, which establishes one important principle in a family settlement deed. And third is about the enforceability of a family settlement deed, which is discussed in Lakshmi Perumallu versus Krishna Venamma. So these three cases play a crucial role in understanding a family settlement deed. So before I dive into it, let me give you a simple example to help you understand what a family settlement deed is all about. So in case of a family here, we usually talk about big families where there are huge number of people involved, like joint families and all, and large properties which is in the names of the ancestors, and no one knows what part of the property you own. Let us say we are there's a family of 25 members, and the great grandfathers have lands of 1,000 acres. Now you all together own 1,000 acres. So if I divide it among all of you also, you would know what amount of share you people get. But of the entire land, if suppose A, B, C are three families, which family owns which portion? Who will decide it? So here I have simply drawn lines saying that this is A's, this is B's, this is C's. But who decides all that? Right? So until and unless they are all one and they are all friendly, there is no problem at all between them. So by which I mean that when there is no dispute, A, B and C will enjoy the entire property. All the family members will jointly enjoy the property without any question. But the moment there is some kind of a tussle between all of them, then they would come to a problem. So then which is nothing but there is a dispute. So how to resolve the dispute, right? So the resolution of a dispute is what is a family settlement deed all about. So there should always be a dispute, and for the resolution of the same, they are entering into a family settlement deed, and hence there would usually be involvement of property. At times there may not be involvement of property. There would be a pure case where there is no involvement of property. Then hence accordingly it's fine. But still there is a need to settle such a dispute, and that is the reason for entering into a family settlement deed. So what are the principles of the family settlement deed which you need to keep in mind? So the family settlement deed principles which you need to keep in mind are: number one, it has to be for a bona fide purpose, and there shall be a fair and equitable division or allotment of properties. So there should not be any force or undue influence. That is the second point. That is completely voluntary, and the purpose should be bona fide, that is to resolve the dispute. And second, whenever there is any distribution of properties involved, it has to be fair and equitable, and the division or the allotment or division of property shall be fair and equitable manner. And a family settlement deed need not necessarily be in writing. It can even be oral. And when it is an oral settlement which has been entered into, there is no need of registration, because the Registration Act Section 17 mandates only when an instrument in writing is establishing a rights over an immovable property. Since here there is no instrument per se, it is only an oral document, and hence there is no need of a registration. And coming to the registration aspect, so where a document has been put in writing and it is dealing with the property value which is more than 100, and hence definitely a family settlement deed is an instrument and it has to be registered because it deals with immovable property. So again, time and again I'm repeating this principle on immovable property. Remember this point. You can write this for any question asked for any contract. So registration is mandatory only in cases of immovable properties where the value of the property is more than 100 rupees. This should be the thumb rule you need to put in your mind. Next, coming to this case of CIT versus R. Ponnamal, I will not go into the merits of the case, but what is established here is that, so usually the principle in a family settlement deed is for any person to get a share in the property, he should either have an antecedent title, claim or interest that is already pre-existing title or pre-existing claim or pre-existing interest or even a possible claim in the property, that is me being a co-parsoner or me being the son of the daughter of the me being the son of the daughter, so I might have the possible claim over the property, so I might be given certain interest. However, if the family members want to give, or rather want to relinquish their rights and give it away to a person, in such cases, such antecedent title shall be assumed, right? So usually this is the general principle, but the exception is if all the existing, if all the family members are fine with it and they have relinquished their rights to give it on to a person, in such a case, there should not be a problem, and all any antecedent title shall be assumed in such a case, right? So this is about this principle, which is very important. And then such a settlement deed shall be binding on the parties to the settlement. So all the people who are on the who are parties to it, it shall be binding to them. And at times there is a possibility that there is there is a dispute, but it is not amounting to any legal claim. So even in such cases, the settlement deed will still stand valid and it shall still be binding on all the parties to the settlement. There need not necessarily be a legal claim which is involved to make it binding, right? So now finally about the enforceability of a family settlement deed. And no doubt a family agreement which is for the benefit of the family generally can be enforced in a court of law. So the Supreme Court said yes, it can be enforced in a court of law, but it must be shown that there was an occasion for effecting a family agreement and that it was acted upon, which means you should prove that there is a sort of a dispute or there was a need to enter into a family settlement deed. It should not be just out of nowhere that you entered. So it means it is trying to establish that yes, the entire family as a whole wanted and there was an occasion to give effect to a family arrangement, and this document is the output of it. That has to be proved before the court, only then it would become enforceable. So this is the discussion on family settlement deed, and with this we come to the end of the lesson. So thanks for watching the video. If you wish to learn more on how to draft, or you want to practice various exercises to sharpen your drafting skills for your examination and also for your practice as a trainee or as a company secretary, please fill in the information in the form which is provided in the description below. We are coming out with a course very soon. Thank you. Stay tuned to Virtual Law, and this is Prakul signing off from VL Academy.